In November 1377, the city-state of Ragusa faced an invisible enemy arriving on the autumn winds. What followed became the world's first organized quarantine, a word that would echo through centuries. This is a story drawn from the pages of history, about a moment when ordinary lives intersected with forces beyond their control, in a time and place where small choices met larger consequences. If you find value in these historical tales, consider subscribing to support this channel and help preserve these stories from the shadows of the past. The morning began as mornings had for 20 years in Luca Ferrante's life, with the salt smell of the Adriatic and the distant cry of gulls circling the harbor. He stood outside the pile gate, watching workers unload amphoras of olive oil from a Venetian merchant vessel, the same rhythm of commerce that had filled his days since he'd first arrived in Ragusa as a young man with ambition and little else. The limestone walls of the city rose behind him, pale gold in the November sun, solid as faith itself. His wife Maria had gone inside at dawn to purchase bread from the baker near the cathedral, a simple errand that required no thought. She did this 3 times each week. The baker's daughter always added an extra roll for their son, Paolo, who was 7 and possessed an appetite that seemed to grow with each passing month. Luca had told Maria he would wait by the gate as he expected a shipment of Dalmatian wine before noon and wanted to inspect the casks personally. The harbor spread before him like a merchant's dream. 3 vessels at anchor to 2 more approaching from the south. Trade had been good this season. The plague that had ravaged cities to the north and east these past 30 years seemed finally to be retreating, or so people said in the taverns. Venice had suffered terribly 2 decades prior. Florence, Milan, entire regions of Francia, all had paid their toll to the pestilence. But Ragusa, tucked against its protective mountains, wrapped in its walls, had been largely spared. Father Domenico emerged from the customs house shortly before the church bells rang for terce. Luca had known the priest for 15 years, had watched the man's hair turn from black to iron gray, had sat through countless sermons about divine judgment and human sin. The priest walked with purpose this morning, his robes gathering dust from the stones, his face set in an expression Luca could not immediately read. "The council meets," Father Domenico said, not in greeting but as statement. "Captain Grimani's ship carries news from Bari." Luca felt something shift in his chest, a small movement like a stone settling into deeper water. "What news?" "The kind that travels faster than ships," the priest replied. He looked past Luca toward the harbor, where Antonio Grimani's vessel, a sturdy cog named Santa Lucia, rode at anchor, its sails already furled. "They lost 2 men during the crossing. Fever, the captain says, buried at sea." The gates had stood open since before memory, great wooden barriers reinforced with iron, swung back against the walls each dawn and closed only at night or during siege. Luca had never considered them as anything but decoration, a reminder of older, more dangerous times when pirates and rival city-states posed tangible threats. The enemy one could see and fight against seemed somehow more honest than what arrived invisible on the wind. Stefan Radovich took his post at the pile gate at midday, as he had done for 4 years since joining the city guard. He was a local man, born in the hills above Ragusa, and he knew most of the merchants by name and reputation. He nodded to Luca, exchanged brief words about the weather turning colder, mentioned that his wife was expecting their 2nd child come spring. These small courtesies formed the fabric of daily life in a city of perhaps 5,000 souls, where everyone occupied some known place in the intricate web of family, trade, guild, and faith. The bell in the Sponza Palace began to ring at an odd hour, not the regular calls to prayer or the marking of the watch, but a sharp, insistent summons. Stefan straightened. Luca turned from his inspection of wine casks to watch As the city's rectors emerged onto the steps, 6 men in their ceremonial robes, faces grave. A crowd began to gather, that peculiar urban instinct that draws people toward centers of authority when something shifts in the established order. By decree of the Major Council of Ragusa, the senior rector announced, his voice carrying across the square, all persons arriving from plague-infected ports shall be detained outside the city walls for a period of 40 days, no exceptions. This measure begins immediately. 40 days. The number itself carried biblical weight. The flood, the temptation in the desert, the periods of purification and trial that marked sacred history. Luca understood the calculation, even as his mind rejected its implications. 40 days to ensure that anyone carrying the pestilence would either recover or die before entering the city proper. A reasonable measure, perhaps even a merciful one, protecting thousands by sacrificing the comfort of dozens. But Maria was inside the walls. The gates closed at noon precisely, their ancient hinges groaning as men put their shoulders to the massive timbers. Luca stood 30 feet away, having been herded back with the other merchants and sailors who'd been conducting business outside the walls. He could see the rector's guards taking positions, could see Stefan among them, the young man's face carefully neutral as he accepted his orders. "This is temporary," someone said behind Luca. He recognized the voice, Marco Benvenuti, a fellow Venetian who traded in silk. "Once they see we're healthy, they'll let us in. A few days at most." But Luca had heard the rector's words clearly. 40 days and not 4. The city was sealing itself against the world, drawing a line between inside and outside, between the protected and the potentially contaminated. It was logic he could not argue with, even as everything in him wanted to push through that gate and find his wife, to bring her back to this side where they could wait together. He called her name. His voice echoed off the limestone walls, joined by other voices as the reality of separation settled over the crowd. Women's voices answered from within, not Maria's yet. She would still be at the baker's, unaware that the world had fundamentally reorganized itself in the span of a morning. More people gathered at the walls, citizens who had suddenly remembered family members on the wrong side of the newly meaningful barrier. Captain Antonio Grimani stood near his ship, supervising the unloading of cargo under the watchful eyes of guards who now maintained careful distance. He was 51 years old, had sailed the Adriatic for 30 years, and his face showed the weathering of salt wind and sun. 2 of his crew lay buried in the deep water between Bari and Ragusa. He had reported the deaths honestly, as regulations required. Fever and weakness, the symptoms that could mean a dozen different ailments, or could mean the one thing everyone feared. "How long were they sick?" Father Domenico asked, approaching the captain with a cloth held over his nose and mouth. 3 days each, Grimani replied. "We gave them what comfort we could. I've seen the plague, Father. This didn't look the same. No buboes, no bleeding, just fever, and then the end." The priest nodded, but his eyes held no reassurance. 40 days, he said, "for all of you, the rector's orders." The afternoon stretched into evening. Luca and the other detained merchants made camp along the rocky ground outside the pile gate, within sight of the walls but separated by an unbridgeable span of air and authority. Some had blankets from their ship's stores. Others, like Luca, had only the clothes they wore and whatever they could purchase from the few vendors brave or desperate enough to sell to them at doubled prices. Maria appeared at the wall near sunset. He saw her figure outlined against the darkening sky, her hand pressed against the stone. He moved toward the barrier until Stefan held up a hand in warning, not unkindly, but firm. There was a distance they could not cross, a boundary enforced not by violence, but by collective agreement that survival required these harsh measures. "Paolo is with my sister," Maria called down, her voice tight. "He's safe. He doesn't understand why you haven't come home." "Tell him I'm working," Luca replied, though the words felt hollow. What work was this, standing in the cold outside the walls of his own city, separated from his family by an invisible threat that might or might not exist? Tell him it won't be long." But 40 days was long. 40 days was the span between autumn and the heart of winter. 40 days was time enough for everything to change or nothing to change, and no way to know which until the days had passed. Father Domenico moved among the people inside the walls, offering what comfort doctrine allowed. He had argued for the quarantine in the council meeting, had cited scripture and the examples of other cities that had failed to act swiftly. Ragusa would not repeat Venice's mistakes. Ragusa would not see its streets filled with the dead, its commerce destroyed, its population halved. If that required hardship, required separation, required what might seem like cruelty, then so be it. God's will operated through human reason, and reason demanded isolation. That night, the first cold rain of November began to fall. Luca huddled beneath a tarp stretched between wooden posts, listening to the water drum against the canvas. He could see lights in the city windows, could imagine Maria lying awake in their bed, could almost feel Paolo's small body pressed against his side as the boy sought warmth and reassurance. Almost, but not quite. The distance was not far in physical terms, perhaps 200 feet, but it might as well have been the span of continents. By the third day, the reality of the situation had settled into routine. The detained merchants organized themselves into something resembling a camp with shared duties and pooled resources. Someone had secured a cart of firewood. Someone else negotiated for bread and cheese to be passed through the gates at arm's length, coins left on stones to be collected after the goods were withdrawn. Commerce adapted, as it always did, finding channels through even the strictest barriers. Captain Grimani's crew showed no further signs of illness, which some took as encouragement. But Father Domenico, watching from the walls, knew that the pestilence could move slowly, could hide itself in healthy-seeming bodies before emerging to kill. 40 days was not arbitrary. It was the minimum span required to be certain, and even then, certainty remained elusive. Luca established his own routine. Each morning at dawn, he would stand at the point closest to the gate and call Maria's name. She would appear, sometimes quickly, sometimes after a delay that set his heart racing until he saw her figure. They would exchange news. Paolo had learned a new song, the baker's daughter had brought soup, Luca's business partner was handling their contracts inside the city. Simple facts that maintained the thread between their old life and this strange new arrangement. Stefan watched these daily exchanges from his post, his face carefully neutral, his hand never far from his weapon, though there had been no violence, no attempts to breach the quarantine. He understood that he stood as the physical manifestation of the city's collective will, the line between what was safe and what might carry death. It was a role he had not chosen but would fulfill, because the alternative was chaos, was uncertainty, was the potential destruction of everything the walls contained. The November wind carried the smell of the sea and something else, wood smoke from cooking fires, the damp earth of approaching winter, the subtle scent of fear that had no name but everyone recognized. Time moved differently under quarantine, each day marked not by accomplishment but by simple survival, by the absence of symptoms, by the slow counting down toward release or revelation. The second week brought a change in the weather, cold wind from the mountains that made the canvas shelters snap and billow through the night. Luca woke each morning with stiffness in his joints, his breath visible in the pre-dawn darkness. The other merchants had begun to form small groups organized by origin and trade, Venetians clustering with Venetians, the Greeks keeping to themselves, the few Florentines maintaining their own fire. It was a miniature city outside the walls, a shadow of the ordered world within, but governed by the same human need for structure and belonging. Antonio Grimani stood at the edge of the encampment, looking out at his ship riding at anchor in the harbor. The Santa Lucia represented 30 years of labor, of careful navigation through storms and pirates and the endless negotiations of Mediterranean commerce. Now it sat idle, his remaining crew confined to the deck, supplies running low, the cargo he'd intended to sell rotting in the hold. 2 more of his men had taken ill during the 5th night, the same fever, the same weakness that had claimed the others. He had not reported these new cases. The knowledge sat in his chest like a stone, growing heavier each day. To report meant extending the quarantine, meant starting the count over at day 1. It meant condemnation from the others who shared this exile, meant admitting that he might have brought exactly what the city feared most into their midst. So he watched his men suffer in silence, brought them what water he could carry, and prayed that they would recover before anyone noticed their absence from the daily gathering. Father Domenico conducted Mass each morning inside the city walls, his voice carrying through the still air to reach the detained merchants outside. Some of them knelt on the rocky ground to receive the blessing they could not physically take, their faces turned toward the city, toward the cathedral they could see but not enter. The priest's sermons during these days focused on trials and testing, on the refining fire that purified gold, on Job's patience in suffering. God does not send us tribulation to destroy us, he intoned from his position above the gate, but to reveal our true nature, to separate the faithful from the faithless, the pure from the corrupt. His eyes swept across the people inside the walls, then moved to those outside. These 40 days shall prove who carries pestilence and who carries only the burden of inconvenience. Luca listened with half his attention, the other half focused on watching for Maria. She had appeared later each morning this week, and he told himself it meant nothing. She was sleeping poorly, or helping Paolo prepare for his day, or attending to the dozen tasks that filled a household's morning hours. But doubt had begun to work its way into his thoughts like water finding cracks in stone, the slow erosion of certainty that came from enforced separation and too much time to think. Stefan's wife gave birth to their daughter on the 15th day of the quarantine. He received the news from another guard during the midday watch change, and for a moment, the boundary he maintained seemed less like duty and more like prison. His wife was inside, safe within the walls with the midwife and her mother, and he stood outside this barrier he himself enforced, unable to hold his newborn child, unable to comfort his wife through the pain and exhaustion of childbirth. "Regulations permit you to enter," the captain of the guard told him. "Your family takes precedence over the watch schedule." But Stefan looked at the detained merchants, at Luca Ferrante, who stood each morning calling to his wife, at the others who maintained their exile without complaint, and shook his head. "If I go inside, I cannot come back out until the 40 days are complete. The watch would be short a man. I'll meet my daughter when this is finished." The captain nodded, respect and something else, perhaps relief, crossing his face. "You're a credit to the city," he said, but the words felt hollow to Stefan, who thought only of a child he had not yet held, of a wife recovering without him, of duty that demanded everything and offered nothing but the cold satisfaction of sacrifice. That afternoon, Luca purchased a length of good wool cloth from a passing vendor, paying 3 times the normal price, and gave it to Stefan to take inside the walls as a gift for the baby. It was a small gesture, perhaps meaningless, but Stefan accepted it with a nod of thanks, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared burden, of men caught in circumstances larger than themselves, making what choices they could within narrow margins. The days had begun to blur together, marked only by the morning count that someone had started maintaining, scratches on a flat stone near the main fire, tiny marks that accumulated toward the number 40. 17 days. 18. 19. Each sunrise brought them closer to release or revelation, though which remained uncertain. Marco Benvenuti fell ill on the 21st day. He woke with fever and chills, his face flushed, his hands trembling as he tried to pour water from the communal jug. The other Venetian merchants drew back, creating space around him, their fear immediate and primal despite weeks of forced companionship. "It's nothing," Marco insisted, though his voice carried no conviction. "A chill from sleeping on the ground. I'll be better by tomorrow." But they had all heard these words before, in other cities, in other times. The pestilence did not announce itself with certainty. It arrived disguised as common illness, revealed itself slowly through symptoms that might be a dozen different ailments or might be the one thing they all feared. By afternoon, Marco could not stand. By evening, he had soiled himself and lay shivering beneath every blanket the others could spare, his lips cracked and bleeding, his eyes unfocused. Luca stood at a distance, watching the Venetian merchants tend to their compatriot with the careful attention of men who knew their own survival might depend on the outcome. If Marco died, if he showed the characteristic signs of plague, the swellings, the blackened flesh, then the count would start over. Day 1. 40 more days outside the walls. Some of them would not survive a winter exposed to the elements. Father Domenico appeared on the walls at sunset, summoned by a guard who had observed the commotion in the camp. He looked down at Marco's prone form, at the circle of space around him, at the fear written clearly on every face. "Has he shown buboes?" the priest called down. "Not yet," one of the Venetians replied. "Only fever." "Then we wait," Father Domenico said. His voice carried no comfort, only the flat certainty of someone who had made peace with necessary cruelty. If God wills that he recovers, he will recover. If not. He left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. The quarantine would extend. The count would begin again. Mercy had limits when survival required ruthlessness. Maria did not appear at the wall the next morning. Luca waited through the dawn, calling her name with increasing desperation, until finally a woman he recognized from the baker's shop appeared in her place. "She's taken ill," the woman called down, her voice apologetic. "Nothing serious," she says, "a head cold. She didn't want you to worry." But Luca worried. How could he not? Marco lay dying in the camp below, and now his wife had fallen ill inside the walls, and the invisible enemy might be everywhere or nowhere, claiming victims according to logic no one understood. He stood at the base of the wall for an hour after the woman departed, staring up at the stones as if he could will himself through them, as if wanting something badly enough could overcome the physical reality of separation. Captain Grimani approached him near midday, his face haggard. The captain had aged 10 years in the past 3 weeks, his eyes sunken, his gait unsteady. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else stood close enough to hear. "2 more of my men are dead. They died 5 days ago. I buried them at night, away from the camp." Luca stared at him, understanding slowly filtering through shock. "You didn't report it." "I couldn't," Grimani's voice cracked. "If I had reported it, they would have started the count over. Everyone here would have suffered 40 more days because of my ship, because of my crew. I thought—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I thought maybe it wasn't the plague. Maybe it was just fever. Maybe it would pass and no one else would fall ill, and we could all go home." "And now Marco is dying," Luca said. Grimani nodded, his face crumpling. "I brought it here. I carried death to this place, and I hid it. And now—" He gestured helplessly at the camp, at the walls, at the city beyond that had sealed itself against exactly this threat. "What do I do?" Luca had no answer. He thought of Maria, ill inside the walls. He thought of Paolo, who might already be infected if his mother carried the pestilence. He thought of Stefan's newborn daughter, innocent and helpless, and of the 5,000 souls packed within Ragusa's protective embrace, all of them vulnerable, all of them depending on these 40 days of isolation to keep them safe. Marco Benvenuti died on the 23rd day, shortly after midnight. The Venetian merchants performed what rites they could, wrapping his body in canvas and carrying it down to a rocky beach beyond the camp where they built a pyre. Father Domenico watched from the walls, his lips moving in silent prayer, his face illuminated by the orange glow of flames that consumed yet another victim of the invisible enemy. By morning, 2 more merchants showed symptoms, 1 Greek, 1 Florentine. The pattern had become unmistakable. The pestilence had indeed arrived with Grimani's ship, had moved among them quietly for weeks, and now emerged to claim its toll. The camp erupted into chaos as healthy men tried to distance themselves from the sick, as accusations flew. as Grimani stood in the center of it all and confessed his concealment to the assembled crowd. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible over the angry shouting. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought—" Someone threw a stone. It struck Grimani's shoulder, drawing blood. Stefan moved immediately, positioning himself between the crowd and the captain, his hand on his sword, his face set in the neutral expression he'd maintained for 23 days. "No violence," Stefan said. "The rector's decree stands. All of you remain detained until the 40 days are complete, starting from today. Anyone who attempts to breach the quarantine will be killed. Anyone who harms another detainee will be arrested and tried when this is over. These are the rules we live by. These are the rules that keep the city safe." The crowd quieted, not from agreement, but from exhausted resignation. 40 more days. The winter would deepen. Some of them would not survive. But the alternative, allowing plague into the city, was unthinkable. 5,000 lives balanced against perhaps 50. The mathematics of survival permitted no sentiment. Luca returned to his position near the wall and called for Maria, knowing she would not appear, needing to try anyway. The baker's woman came instead, her face grave. "Your wife is very ill," she said. "The physician has seen her. He says—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He says you should prepare yourself." The words reached Luca as if from a great distance. Maria, ill, dying perhaps while he stood outside the walls, powerless to help, separated by a barrier that existed to protect her and had instead become the instrument of her isolation. He sank to his knees on the rocky ground, no longer caring who saw his grief, no longer maintaining the stoic facade that men were supposed to present in the face of tragedy. Father Domenico watched from above, his face troubled. The quarantine was working as designed. The pestilence remained outside the walls, killing only those who had already been exposed. But Maria Ferrante was inside the walls, had been inside from the beginning, and if she died of plague, it meant the disease had already entered the city before the gates closed. It meant the 40 days had been insufficient. It meant everything they had suffered might be meaningless. The winter solstice arrived during the second cycle of 40 days, bringing with it a darkness that seemed to extend beyond the merely seasonal. Luca had stopped counting the scratches on the stone marker. Numbers had ceased to matter when Maria's illness had revealed the fundamental failure of the quarantine. The pestilence had been inside the walls all along, carried by someone who showed no symptoms, spreading silently through the narrow streets while the city congratulated itself on its protective measures. 7 people inside the walls had fallen ill by the new year. Maria died on the 38th day of the first quarantine, 2 days before the gates would have opened, 2 days before Luca could have held her hand or said goodbye properly. Paolo survived his mother's death by 11 days before the fever claimed him too. The baker's daughter brought Luca this news on a gray morning when frost covered the ground and his breath came in white clouds. "He asked for you at the end," she said, her own voice thick with grief. "He kept saying his papa would come soon, that you were just working outside the walls. He never understood why you didn't come home." Luca heard these words and felt something break inside him that would never properly heal. His son had died believing his father had abandoned him, had spent his final conscious moments waiting for a reunion that regulations and fear had made impossible. The knowledge was a weight he would carry for whatever remained of his life, a burden that made each breath feel like theft from the ones who had stopped breathing. Father Domenico performed the funeral rites for Maria and Paolo together, burying them in the cathedral cemetery alongside the other plague victims. From his position outside the walls, Luca could see the small procession, could see the priest's gestures of blessing, could imagine the prayers he himself should have been saying but could not. Because 40 days had become 60, had become 80, had become an indefinite exile as new cases continued to appear, both inside and outside the quarantine line. Stefan held his daughter for the first time on the day Luca's son was buried. The captain of the guard had finally ordered him inside the walls, declaring that his continued separation from his family served no purpose now that the pestilence had breached the defenses. The young guard climbed through the gate in the evening, and Luca watched him go with something that wasn't quite envy, but wasn't quite resignation either. Just a dull acknowledgement that some men got to hold their children, and some men watched from a distance as theirs were lowered into the ground. The camp outside the walls had thinned considerably. Of the 53 merchants and sailors originally detained, 19 had died. 13 others had been moved to a separate isolation area, farther from the walls when they showed symptoms. The remaining 21 maintained their vigil with the grim determination of survivors, men who had made it this far and intended to continue simply because the alternative was to lie down and surrender. Captain Antonio Grimini hanged himself from the mast of the Santa Lucia on a cold night in mid-January. His remaining crew found him at dawn, his body swaying gently in the wind that blew across the harbor. They cut him down and buried him without ceremony, without informing the authorities, another secret concealment in a season that had become defined by what remained unspoken. Father Domenico had stopped giving sermons about divine testing and purification. The theology that had seemed so clear in November had grown muddied by the reality of January. Innocent children dead, faithful merchants exiled indefinitely, the pestilence moving according to no logic anyone could discern. He still conducted masses, still performed the necessary rituals, but his heart had gone out of the pronouncements. He was simply going through the motions now, maintaining structure because structure was all that remained when meaning had fled. Inside the city, commerce had ground nearly to a halt. The harbor stood empty of foreign vessels. No merchants would risk Ragusa's waters now that word had spread of the extended quarantine and the plague deaths within the walls. The shops still opened, the market still convened, but everything moved with the slow exhaustion of a community that had been holding its breath for too long and found that breathing hurt. Luca spent his days in a kind of stupor, performing the minimal actions required to sustain life, but finding no purpose beyond continued existence. He ate because others brought him food. He slept because exhaustion eventually claimed him. He stood at the wall each morning, not because he expected anyone to appear, but because the routine was all that separated him from complete dissolution. The baker's daughter still came sometimes, offering news of the city, but there was less and less to report. Life had contracted to its barest essentials, survival and burial in alternating measure. Stefan returned to his post on the walls in February, leaving his wife and daughter in their small house near the harbor. He had held his child for 6 weeks, had watched her learn to smile, had experienced the fierce protective love that fatherhood kindled. Now he stood again as the barrier between inside and outside, but the role felt hollow. What were they protecting anymore? The pestilence was everywhere and nowhere, killing seemingly at random, respecting no boundaries. The last death inside the walls occurred on the 14th of March. An elderly woman who had lived through the original quarantine period in apparent health only to fall ill as spring approached. The physician who examined her body found the characteristic swellings, the darkened flesh, the unmistakable signs of plague that had killed so many. But she was the last. After her burial, no new cases appeared. The camp outside the walls had been abandoned by then. Of the original 53 detainees, only 12 remained alive, and the Rector's Council had quietly permitted them to move to an unused warehouse near the harbor, a building that stood separate from the main city, but offered at least walls and a roof. Luca occupied a corner of this space, his few possessions arranged on the floor, his eyes focused on nothing in particular for hours at a time. The gates opened officially on the 21st of March, the spring equinox, exactly 141 days after they had first closed. Stefan stood at his post as the timber barriers swung back, revealing a passage that had been sealed through the entire winter. The 12 surviving merchants emerged from their warehouse exile, blinking in the spring sunlight, moving with the careful steps of men who had forgotten how to walk freely. Luca entered the city for the first time since November. The streets looked the same limestone walls, the same cathedral rising against the sky, the same narrow lanes he had walked for 20 years. But everything felt different, emptied of meaning, a stage set from which the actors had departed. He made his way to the cathedral cemetery and found Maria's grave, marked with a simple wooden cross. Paolo's name had been carved beneath hers, smaller letters for a smaller life. He stood there for a long time, trying to find words that might serve as prayer or farewell or apology. Nothing came. Language had failed him, just as everything else had failed. The quarantine, the city's protection, his own inability to breach the walls when it mattered most. He was alive and they were dead, and there was no meaning to be extracted from this fact, no lesson to be learned except that history moved according to its own logic and crushed whoever stood in its path. Father Domenico found him there as the sun began to set, the priest's shadow falling across the graves. They stood in silence for several minutes before the older man spoke. "I told them it was God's will," Domenico said quietly. "I told them the quarantine would save the city, that 40 days of hardship was a small price to pay for protection. I believed it." "And now?" Luca asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Now I don't know what I believe." The priest looked around at the cemetery, at the dozens of fresh graves that marked the winter's toll. The pestilence killed inside the walls and outside them. It killed the faithful and the faithless, the young and the old. The quarantine failed, and it succeeded. We lost perhaps 200 souls, but 5,000 survived. Was that God's will, human wisdom, blind chance? Luca had no answer. He suspected there was no answer, that they had all been actors in a tragedy written by forces beyond their comprehension, playing their assigned roles until the curtain fell. Maria and Paolo had played their parts. Captain Grimani had played his. Even the pestilence itself had played a part, arriving on schedule, killing according to its own mysterious logic, departing when it chose to depart. "I'm leaving Ragusa," Luca said. The decision formed as he spoke it, emerging from some deep place he hadn't known existed. "There's nothing for me here anymore." Father Domenico nodded slowly. "Where will you go?" "Somewhere else. Anywhere else." Luca gestured vaguely toward the west, toward the sea and the lands beyond. "Somewhere I don't see these walls every morning. Somewhere I don't remember what it felt like to stand outside while my family died inside." The priest made the sign of blessing, an automatic gesture that carried no conviction. "May God go with you," he said, but the words sounded as hollow as everything else that winter had taught them to say without meaning. Luca Ferrante left Ragusa on an April morning, his few possessions packed in a canvas bag, his passage secured on a Genoese merchant vessel heading west. He stood at the ship's rail as they pulled away from the harbor, watching the limestone walls recede into the distance, watching the city that had been his home for 20 years become just another cluster of buildings on a rocky coast. Stefan stood on the pile gate, his daughter in his arms, watching the ships in the harbor. He had survived the winter, his family had survived, but the guilt of that survival sat heavy on him, the knowledge that his presence on the walls, his enforcement of the quarantine, had kept fathers from sons, husbands from wives, had maintained a barrier that proved ultimately meaningless. He would continue his duties because men continued their duties, but something had broken inside him that winter, some faith in the order of things that could not be restored. Father Domenico conducted Easter Mass in the cathedral, his voice echoing through the vaulted space, speaking words of resurrection and renewal to a congregation that had buried too many dead to find comfort in promises of heavenly reunion. The pestilence had passed, as pestilences always eventually passed. Life would continue. Trade would resume. The city would rebuild its population, would learn its lessons or fail to learn them, would continue its existence on this rocky coast where the mountains met the sea. The gates stood open now, would remain open through the spring and summer and into the next fall. Guards still watched them, still checked the papers of arriving merchants, still asked careful questions about where ships had been and what cargo they carried. The memory of that winter remained fresh enough to demand vigilance, to justify caution, to excuse the lingering fear that the invisible enemy might return at any moment. Years later, other cities would adopt Ragusa's innovation, the 40-day quarantine that gave birth to a word and a practice that would echo through centuries of public health responses. The system would be refined, improved, made more humane in its application. But in that spring of 1378, it was simply something they had survived, a trial they had endured, a season when the gates closed and people died on both sides of the walls, and no amount of planning or precaution had been sufficient to prevent the thing they most feared. The limestone walls still stand today, pale gold in the Adriatic sun, solid as faith itself. Tourists walk along them, taking photographs, marveling at medieval engineering, knowing nothing of the winter when those walls became a barrier between life and death, safety and exposure, the protected and the abandoned. The cemetery holds its secrets. The harbor fills with boats. The city continues, as cities always continue, built on layers of forgotten tragedy and quiet survival. Luca Ferrante's name appears in no historical records after his departure from Ragusa. He became one of the countless individuals swept up in history's great movements, his personal tragedy absorbed into the larger narrative of plague and quarantine and the birth of public health measures that would shape centuries of response to epidemic disease. Somewhere he lived the rest of his life, somewhere he died, but the cathedral cemetery in Ragusa holds the graves that mattered most to him, marked by weathered crosses bearing names the tourists never notice. The story ends not with resolution, but with continuation. The stubborn persistence of life after tragedy, the slow rebuilding of ordinary routines, the gradual fading of acute grief into chronic absence. Stefan's daughter grew up, Father Domenico grew old, the city endured. And somewhere in the Adriatic, ships still sailed carrying cargo and passengers, and occasionally the invisible seeds of disease, while port cities watched and wondered and tried to calculate the mathematics of protection against an enemy that could not be seen until it was too late.